Do you consider yourself an ordinary, decent person? Well, then let me ask you another question. Do you think that you and other ordinary, decent persons could be trusted to reach an agreement about what constitutes dishonest behavior? Because if you're ever called to serve on a jury and the question of the defendant's dishonesty is at issue, the judge will rely on you and your fellow jurors, these ordinary, decent people, to arrive at a consensus and decide whether certain kinds of behavior can be considered dishonest. So in effect, it'll be assumed that you all have more or less the same moral standards. And that's because this concept of dishonesty, which is central to a range of offenses, including theft, is not defined in statutes such as the Theft Act. So nowhere does the Theft Act, for instance, contain words to the effect, the definition of dishonesty is. Instead, over the years, the job of setting the test which jurors and others use to define the word dishonesty has fallen to courts, who are the constitutional interpreters of the law, a job that some people think rightly belongs to Parliament, the constitutional makers of the law. And the UK Supreme Court acted in this capacity most recently in a civil case called Ivy and Genting Casinos, a case which has ramifications for criminal law where we deal with offenses such as theft. Now, the case involved a guy called Phil Ivey, who's been called the Tiger Woods of poker. Now, Phil Ivey wins over £7 million at a card game, but Genting Casinos refuses to pay out, alleging that he had cheated and was dishonest because he used a method called edge sorting to fix the game in his favor. Now, I don't know much about card games, but my buddy Google tells me that edge sorting involves trying to gain an advantage in a card game by trying to spot peculiarities on the back of individual cards as they're lying face down so that you determine their values. So Ivey claims he did not think that what he was doing was cheating. He argues that this is a legitimate advantage play and that he was just being clever. And he says that he was not being dishonest because he genuinely believed that his actions were legit. And so he sues. Now, subsequent courts find against Ivey, and the case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court where, drumroll please, the court rejects Ivey's argument and dismisses his appeal. And in doing so, the Supreme Court transforms the test for dishonesty, which now comes down to this crucial question: whether according to, you guessed it, the standards of ordinary, decent people, the defendant's acts were dishonest. Which brings me back to my original questions. Do you consider yourself an ordinary, decent person? And if so, do you think that you and other ordinary, decent persons could agree on what dishonest behavior looks like? Because as many commentators have argued, judges such as those in the Supreme Court sure seem to think so. But if their assumptions are wrong, then this central issue at the heart of the law that deals with property is on rather shaky ground. Now, in my classes when I teach the offense of theft, I try to find out whether there's a consensus among my students about what type of behavior may be considered dishonest, or whether such a notion is merely a mirage. A thing that doesn't exist. So to do this, I use a small-scale version of a public survey conducted several years ago by Emily Finch and Stefan Fafinski in the Honesty Lab project. And I use some of the very questions they put to their participants. Now, I ask my students to vote anonymously on whether different day-to-day scenarios represent dishonest behavior. I must confess that in my version, I give students a chance to choose "I'm not sure" as a response, just because it generates such juicy discussions afterwards. But here's some of the results that I've had from past cohorts. Now, the first question I always start with, which is just a lovely icebreaker, is: do you think it is dishonest for someone to keep money found on the street? This is a wonderful question because you kind of get a sense of what people think about what are the limits, was someone looking? And that generates an interesting discussion where a majority of students seem to think that it is honest behavior. Then I get on to, do you think it is dishonest for someone to take a DVD from a shop without paying for it? This one produces near unanimous response in terms of people saying, yes, this is dishonest behavior. And then I ask them, well, do you think it is dishonest for someone to download pirated music? Now, this might be a generational thing, which tells us something about dishonesty as a concept in terms of people's changing ideas about what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable, and in this case, what is legal and possibly illegal. Then I move on to, do you think it's dishonest for a carer to persuade an elderly person to change their will in their favor? This one again draws a large number of people saying, yes, that's dishonest behavior. And then I ask, well, do you think it's dishonest for someone to wear a dress before returning it to the shop? Now, at this point, you get all sorts of mixed responses. Before I finally hit them with this one, I love ending on this one. I ask them, do you think it is dishonest for a man to conduct an online romance behind his wife's back? And then the class goes up in flames, literally. But again, near unanimous responses on this. So what does this tell us about the existence of a group of ordinary, decent people with a consensus about what dishonesty means? It's interesting that year after year, there are some questions which produce near unanimity or a high level of consensus, while other responses are mixed. We have interesting discussions in our classes about why this may be the case, but even from our small-scale, quick and dirty anonymous survey, the results highlight something that's really important for the law, and that is the diversity of opinion that's out there when it comes to moral questions like dishonesty. In fact, when Finch and Fafinski did the extensive survey, they noted significant differences in the responses amongst different age groups and genders. So we do well to ask ourselves whether we should base such an important legal test on a concept which Parliament does not define and which has instead been left to jurors and others with likely myriad ideas about where to draw the line on moral issues like dishonesty. So is it about time that Parliament gave us a definition of dishonesty to work with? It's a really fascinating topic and one I always look forward to exploring with students at Solent University's Law School. Now, if you're thinking about studying law, or if you've enjoyed this little glimpse of how complex and captivating the law can be, I hope you'll think about studying here with us.